Hey, everybody, and welcome to Life is a Gamble. This is episode number 11, and my guest today is Frank Frigo, who is one of the founders of a company called Zeus. And I believe you guys were the first to start modeling NFL football, weren't you? Or
Well, we were one of the early ones. And just for a small clarification, Zeus was the original name of the simulation model that we developed. Chuck Bauer, a physicist, and myself. The company that we founded was Edge Analytics and subsequently Edge Sports, which is an analytics company that did a lot of work in sports, but also in other industries like healthcare and education.
okay, so when did you guys first come up with this idea, and how did it come about?
Okay. I think the best way to describe how it started was me as a football fan watching games and being convinced without solid proof that coaches were risk averse in the NFL and were probably giving up a lot of value. And I knew as a backgammon player, as a games player in general, that it's human nature to be, it's a standard cognitive bias to be risk averse. And a lot of people don't really think probabilistically and in terms of expected value. And that seemed to be apparent with coaches, particularly on what we always referred to as directional choices, fourth down decisions, these binary types of things, like these critical moments when you're deciding between two very distinctive paths. Do I try to retain the ball, score additional points, or give it up on a punt or settle for a field goal? Do I go for 2 or 1 on the 2-point conversion? Do I do an onside kick or a regular kick? And it seemed like coaches were erring on the side of being conservative, but didn't really have anything to prove it other than just my general intuition. So it was a problem I had been mulling over in my head for a while, and I was pretty familiar with programming achievements, neural nets in backgammon in particular and in other games, and was kicking around the idea of how could we build a model to actually test this? Because there were others out there that I think suspected that coaches were giving up value, but nobody was really measuring it. And I was trying to think about it in more of a commercial context that, wow, if you could actually prove this and show mathematically that it's costing them, this is a commercial opportunity. So I didn't quite know how to go about it. I was doing various kind of back of the envelope calculations and so forth. And Chuck Bauer, who's an experimental physicist and a good friend of mine, and also a very good backgammon player, was also familiar with, a lot of the work that had been done in modeling games. And we were talking about a way to go about this. And to make a long story short, we developed a simulation model. We basically put together the logic of the game, the way teams typically behave. We had a certain amount of data accessible to us. So the early version of the model was a way to play the game from start to finish, from the opening kickoff, running clock, penalties, and all, for 2 generic league average teams. And what it allowed us to do was, through a Monte Carlo simulation, once we had written out all of the logic, we could set up any unique situation in the game and allow it to play to conclusion. And the variables that define the game state were, who possesses the ball, where's the ball on the field, down, distance, score, clock, timeouts remaining, all these things. And we could do it. We could set up a situation, either opening kickoff, any stage of the game, and let it play to conclusion and estimate the win probability for the teams. It was kind of a crude approach. It was, these were league average generic opponents. But we were able to back test it against sort of known game states where there actually was a lot of data. So if a team was leading by 7 points at the half or the end of the third quarter, we had some benchmarks that we could say, how does that compare to what our model's producing through the simulation? And if we're capturing those points reasonably well, then chances are we're probably capturing some of the in-between points pretty well too. So that kind of got us started. And
what year was this?
Oh gosh, I was kicking this idea around really in the late 90s, but I didn't engage Chuck until about 2001, I think. Um, we had talked about this idea. I told him I was thinking about it, and I was living in Louisville at the time. He was living in Bloomington because he was working as a research physicist at IU. And I knew Chuck knew how to do simulations as a physicist. So I went up, we met at a coffee shop in Bloomington. We sat down. I mapped out this idea that I had. He was a little lukewarm on it. I think he thought like, oh God, this is going to I'm going to go down the rabbit hole here. So I don't think he was
which you were,
which I was. Yes. And I did. But I think he was kind of curious about it. And we got off to a pretty slow start. Things weren't really happening. And then I remember I followed up with him and said, are we going to do this thing or not? And his response, I think at the time was, I'll tell you what, if you write up the basic logic of coaching behavior, down, distance, and so forth, we'll take a shot at putting a simulation model together. So I did. I mean, I literally got paper and pencil out, and I came up with kind of a flow charts of, and again, I wasn't trying to construct logic of optimal behavior. I was trying to construct logic of common behavior. If a coach is in this type of a situation, these are typically short passes, some percentage of the time. I did have some data that I was able to draw upon. So I came up with some charts for the basic logic of the game. And that was the original basis of the Monte Carlo simulation. So we were able to get one off the ground. I can't remember how much time that took in testing and retesting and so forth. But we got to a point where we were pretty comfortable with a simulation model that could actually play a game to conclusion. And I think my original estimate might have been that coaches were giving up somewhere around a half a game a season on average. I think that might have been my original thought. Turned out the early version of the model revealed they were worse than that. It was actually more likely to be closer to a game. And in a 16 game, which was a 16 game season at the time, that's a lot.
Yeah.
And we're looking at that going, oh, wait a minute. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry. The lowest NFL franchise is probably at the time was probably worth $2 billion. And we can mathematically show that with better decision-making, they could get an extra game a season. If you're a 9-17 team and we can get you to 10-6, that might get you into the playoffs. Like they're going to roll out the red carpet for us. This is really cool. And I came from a background as a commodity trader in the energy markets. And, if I would have walked into a hedge fund manager with this good of a value proposition, I mean, I'd have stood on the boardroom table and beat my chest, right? And they'd have thrown money at me. So I'm thinking this is what's going to happen in the NFL. So, there's nothing like a little naivete and ignorance to get you motivated to try to do something. So I was very motivated and I was working a day job at the time to reach out to NFL teams. I mean, I will tell you, it's amazing. If you pick up the phone and call the front office and just ask to speak to somebody, you'd be amazed at how often you can actually get a general manager or a head coach to call you back.
Wow. That is shocking.
It happened way more than I thought. Maybe I was a little more clever about it than the average person might have been in terms of, trying different phone numbers and techniques. But we were able to get audiences. Our first audience was with the Cincinnati Bengals, and Marvin Lewis, the head coach, the head of player personnel was there, the defensive and offensive coordinators.
Now, what year was this?
I think this was around 2004, maybe. I'm not going to get all my dates perfectly right here, but that was the first legitimate NFL meeting we had.
I have to say, I met you through my brother, Jake, who's also a backgammon player. And I remember at the time, Jake telling me like, Frank and Chuck, they built this model for NFL. And that was really kind of the heyday of offshore internet gambling. It was before the UIGEA went, and they were throwing money at people, and I was like, oh my God, these guys are going to make a fortune. He's like, no, they don't want to bet. They want to sell it to the teams. And I was, I just was shocked going, what, are they crazy? Like, But
Well,
yeah, okay. So now you're expecting them to just, bring out wheelbarrows full of money when you come to them. And
yeah,
what
yeah.
happens? You meet the Bengals first?
Yeah, we meet the Bengals first, and there was a particular quote in that meeting that was a real eye opener for me, which is at the end of the meeting, Marvin Lewis, who was a longtime head coach of the Cincinnati Bengals. He was very nice. He said, "This is super interesting," and he said, and you guys may well be right. You might be right that we're being too conservative in this situation, and it's costing us. He said, but you're not the guy that has to go talk to the press on Monday morning. I am. And, you're not the guy that has to look the players in the eye. You're not the guy that has to, talk to the owner group about why I did something that was counterintuitive and worked or didn't work. And so that was the first time we were really able to sort of peer into this culture, this curious culture of the NFL, which made us realize, maybe it's not all about win optimization. Maybe there's other metrics at play that are affecting these decisions.
More risk aversion and and more protecting my job.
Exactly. I mean, so one of the biggest proponents we had and supporters that we had very early on was a guy by the name of Jim Schwartz. And Jim Schwartz was, at the time we met him, the defensive coordinator of the Tennessee Titans. He had us come down to Nashville. He met with us at the NFL Combine. We sat in his hotel room and he was like, "This is so cool. I'm going to be a head coach someday. I will use this. I hope you guys don't sell it before I become a head coach because this is going to be amazing. And here's who you need to talk to." And da-da-da. He was like super supportive. He claimed he was a chess player, and then when I asked him what his ELO was, he's like, "What's an ELO?" And then I knew he wasn't really a chess player. But, he's a fairly smart guy, and true to his word, he became a head coach. He ended up getting the head coaching job at the Detroit Lions. And guess what? When he became a head coach with the Detroit Lions, he wasn't the same guy that he was in that hotel room because he had just signed his 5-year multi-million-dollar contract. And damn if he was going to go before the Lions fans and have to explain why he did something counterintuitive and it worked or it didn't work. And you could really see it, right? I mean, from his personal risk management, it was very different than about just optimizing team wins. It was about, how do I make sure I've got enough? I'm good. I got enough in the kitty for my life, and I don't need to shake that up. I finally got this job, and you could kind of see. Now, that being said, he did take our reports, and we met with him at the Lions and his staff and so forth. But he wasn't quite the receptive guy we thought he was going to be. And interestingly enough, before he got that, just to go back a little bit, before he got that job with the Detroit Lions, he was one of the leading candidates when an opening came about with the San Francisco 49ers. And we were at the time in with the 49ers, with Terry Donahue, the GM, and a guy by the name of Parag Marathe, who was an ex-Bain consultant, who was basically their head of analytics and player personnel, who was a big proponent of what we were doing and literally wanted to hire Schwartz because he felt Schwartz was going to subscribe to this kind of thinking and this would be a great package deal. Turned out the York and the DeBartolo family ended up hiring, what the heck was the guy's name? Nolan, I think was his name, instead of Schwartz. But I remember on the eve of the interview, Schwartz calling me saying, "Hey, I'm going to be talking to them all about Zeus," because he really wanted to pitch himself as this analytics guru and the whole thing. It was part of his resume. And, we were trying to help out and prime the whole thing up. And he ended up not getting the job, but he later got the job with Detroit. And what it made you realize too was that these coaches wanted to talk the game of analytics, but not necessarily apply it. I sort of liken it to the person that, has the fancy piece of fitness equipment in the corner of the room because they want all their friends to think they work out every day, but they never actually use it,
Yeah.
And we subsequently realized that was in play as well. They wanted to check that analytics box and drop names, but they didn't necessarily want to, have the courage to actually take it onto the field. So that was another thing that we were dealing with.
I don't remember when the whole Moneyball thing was happening in baseball. Do you remember if that was pre this or after this? Because it was the exact same problems that you were facing.
Yeah, I think so. Bill James was at this sabermetrics early on. He was working out of his garage or basement or whatever, doing his thing. And then, of course, the story with the movie and the Michael Lewis novel about, how Paul D. Podesta and, Billy Beane got together and really kind of shook things up with the A's and so forth. I don't know all of the exact years or exactly when the book and movie came out. It definitely overlapped our time, because after the movie came out and Paul D. Podesta, he was really the brains behind the thing. He subsequently got the GM job with the Dodgers. This young Harvard kid, and he cut his teeth in football, by the way. I think he worked with the Browns before he worked in baseball or with the A's. We met with him at Dodger Stadium, and I can remember distinctly walking down the hallway and getting looked up and down by Tommy Lasorda, giving Chuck and me a look like, all right, now who's D. Podesta talking to now? Because he was doing all these controversial things with the Dodgers, just like is portrayed in the movie with the A's, and the old school guys didn't like it, When things weren't going well, they wanted to blame the analytics guy. And when things were going well, some people were crediting him, and he was a pretty humble guy. He told us behind closed doors, he's like, yeah, they want to hang me when, things aren't going well. And he goes, and then I get credit when things are going well. And he goes, and a lot of this might just be randomness. It doesn't happen that fast, But it was a fascinating discussion with him because he did sort of make connections to Moneyball in baseball and what we were doing in football. And he was really impressed. We gave him a little demo. He was very impressed with what we had done and was talking about the nuances of football analytics versus baseball analytics. And there are some really clear differences. In baseball, you're basically trying to produce runs and keep your opponent from producing runs. And that correlates really well with win probability. In football, it's much more contextual. You get into the utility of points, which is actually, quite frankly, a lot like playing tournament backgammon. Because the clock is decaying, because there's these different scores late in the game, not all points have the same value. And football has the added piece that you score in these different increments. So it creates some really difficult problems about how does scoring and retaining the ball and extending a drive to try to score a touchdown versus taking a field goal or punting, how does it affect win probability? Well, our simulation model was really well suited for that. And so we were drawing comparisons with D. Podesta about, what he had learned through the whole Moneyball movement and baseball modeling. And one really funny statement that he made at one point was, he was encouraging us to keep after it, but he said, what we learned in baseball early on with sabermetrics is, he said, outs are bad. He said, basically you just don't volunteer outs, and, it's a fair point. So, but, they were ahead of the curve in baseball for sure. They got out there early on, and baseball's got a 162 game season. So there's a little more time to sort of test ideas and see subtle effects and so forth. But, it's more of an abstract idea in football because you got a shorter season and you're trying to convince somebody you actually win the game 10, 15% more often when you make this particular play choice on a fourth down, but there's a lot of variance. You don't always see the result immediately.
Of course, yeah,
and that's a hard thing for some of those guys to embrace.
Yeah. So when did who finally bought in and said, yes, we get it, we're going to use it, and then actually did?
So
Anybody?
the first people that actually wrote us a check in the NFL were the Jacksonville Jaguars. They had read a little bit because I used to publish some sports analytics for different sports media. I wrote regularly for the New York Times. I used to do stuff for Fox Sports and a bunch of others. So the Jaguars had reached out to us, and they were trying to put together some strategy around overtimes, and they asked us if we could help them with it. And it was a pretty small paid gig. The first really substantial client we had was the Eagles. And they were particularly open-minded. And they had a culture, and it really came down from Jeff Lurie. And Jeff Lurie was like best buddies and neighbors with Jeff Yazoo, the founding partner of Susquehanna, which is an extremely innovative private partnership, one of the pioneers of options trading and biggest equity options market maker in the world at the time. And I used to work for Susquehanna, so I knew Jeff. So I had a bit of a connection to get to Jeff Lurie, the owner of the Eagles. And Jeff Lurie is a very smart guy. I mean, he gets analytics, and he was the first. We were knocking on lots of different doors, but with the Eagles, I mean, he sat in the meeting with us. And Howie Roseman, the GM, was there, and Alec Halaby, the head of analytics, was there. Doug Peterson at the time was not there, who was the Super Bowl coach in 2017. But Lurie was at the table asking all the questions, and so what you saw there that was really important was that you could get a head coach to do something if the GM had their back, and if the owner had the GM's back, and if the head of analytics was in the room. And the Eagles, I think, took that approach because I think Lurie basically told Peterson, do what's mathematically correct. I'm not going to second guess you. Don't worry about the press on Monday morning, like Marvin Lewis had said. Just do the right thing. If it's mathematically defensible, do it. So they were really the first ones that kind of embraced it. But even they, I think, slow rolled it a little bit. That Super Bowl season, we worked really closely with them. We worked with them. We were a paid client of the Eagles for multiple years. And we were very integrated with their analytics staff. So we would, because there were NFL rules restrictions, I should make this point, you can't actually process information during the game and run live simulations. So they would ask us to, in advance, run hypothetical scenarios and create a thick book that they could navigate. What's the score difference? What's the range of the time? We're in the middle of the third quarter. We're in this section of the field, and it served as a guide. So they could use that, and then they could have a guy on the headset with the head coach or the offensive coordinator say, look, it's first down. If we pick up 7 yards in the next 3 downs, we know we have a fourth down go. They already in advance knew that from the model, and that allowed them to even dictate their earlier play calling. And there was a lot of, very strong game theoretical pieces to this because now they were operating a little differently than other teams. If it was 3rd and 8 and they knew 4th and 2 was mathematically correct, they could go out and, instead of trying to pick up the whole first down, like conventional wisdom would suggest, they might run a pass play that gets them 6 yards. And then immediately, without calling a timeout, line up and go for it on 4th and 2. And that's what they were using very effectively. So not only were they doing the right thing on 4th downs, and they were building plays around that, they knew leading up to it that they could use that to their advantage as well. So they were getting a lot of value out of it. And
did the media notice that they were doing things differently, and what did the media and the talking heads have to say about what was going on?
They did. And in fact, Peterson would go to press conferences and he would get asked about some counterintuitive decision that he made, and he'd say, it's what the analytics told us to do, and we're following it. He was saying those kinds of things. So yes, the media was catching on to it, and the real sort of crescendo of that was the New York Times ran a feature article on us on Super Bowl Sunday when the day the Eagles won the Super Bowl. The New York Times ran a feature full-page article on, how the Eagles are following the math, or I can't remember the exact name of it, but you could look it up. They were basically saying that, if you've noticed that the Eagles don't behave like every other NFL team and are doing, kind of head scratching things and so forth, there's a reason for it. There's this little company in Louisville, Kentucky that built this technology that the Eagles are using. And then that night they go out, play the Super Bowl, win, do all these things that were very different, right? So, in the game, they did all kinds of really interesting, the kinds of things I'm describing. And when we ran the analysis on that game, they followed us to the T. I mean, it was they had like a 0 error rate by our judgment. I mean, they just played it. They played it spot on. And these decisions, we could measure them. I mean, they're not trivial. And there were games where NFL teams would give up a quarter a game of expected value, a half a game of expected value. Like it can happen. And they were spot on in that game. So that was really like a key moment for us. We got this publicity. We got it in advance. Then they go out and do exactly what the article talked about.
So then all the teams showed up with wheelbarrows full of money.
That still didn't happen. We ended up, it was known. Those people talk. It's a big fraternity in the NFL. We ended up working with, I think we ended up with about 12 paid clients in the NFL over time. We had 2 Super Bowl champions, the Kansas City Chiefs. In both of their Super Bowl wins used our model. I used to consult. I'd be on the phone with their head of analytics sometimes on Saturdays, and he'd ask me, if we encounter the following situation, how would I use the model to kind of, decide what we should do, and it wasn't just about fourth downs either. Sometimes it was about, penalty acceptance or, what to do on a 2-point conversion. We even had teams ask us about things like, when did you take an intentional safety? I mean, that's a strategy, right? And we could shed great light on that. Funny enough, there's actually been a lot of talk in the NFL about they have changed the overtime rules for the playoffs and the regular season, but there's been some talk about a very creative solution to overtime called pick and choose, where you flip the coin. One team gets to decide on possession and the other team gets to decide on where they place the ball on the field, which is a really kind of a unique idea. And we even had the committee in the NFL, the rules committee, reach out to us and ask us our opinion on the optimal strategy for doing that and how you would go about it. So we've been involved in a lot of different aspects of the game. And, but yeah, we ended up working with about a third of the teams. One of the problems with the business model in the NFL too was, first of all, it wasn't a huge revenue generator for us. It was great for PR, for Edge. But often what we would find is the teams would license our technology and they were trying to build their own internal tools. So I think sometimes they were using our model and then using it to calibrate a lot of their own internal systems. And they'd use it for a year and go, hey, thanks a lot. That was great. We're good to go now, And analytics has become so commonplace now in the NFL, or at least what they call analytics. And, every team's got an analyst. A lot of times they hire some kid out of an Ivy League school.
But even so, aren't they still playing really badly? I shouldn't say badly, less than optimal by a fair margin.
There's still a lot of less than optimal going on. I haven't measured it very closely this past year, but we did see an improvement. There was kind of inflection point a couple of years ago where they really did start to get better at it. But I still think there's a way to go. I mean, I feel like there's, the word analytics is used in a very broad sense. Analytics is, technology, that wearables on the body. What's your temperature and heart rate, and how do we keep you from getting a concussion and build a better helmet? And analytics is, other player tracking, maximum speed. And analytics is, how do we choose a player out of college that has the highest probability of being a Pro Bowler in 5 years? And what are the key characteristics that you can observe and test before the draft that are precursors to how they might perform down the road? Those are all kind of analytics. We were doing a very specialized part of analytics, which the best way I would describe it is, and I gave a talk on this at the MIT Sloan Analytics Conference one year about win probability as a currency. So this idea that, to use a poker analogy, win probability is like poker chips. So if you think about it, at the start of a football game, if you had two evenly matched teams, they both have 50 chips of win probability. And it's a zero-sum game, so at any moment in time, they're making decisions, they're executing, they're trading those chips. If one team gets to 60, the other drops to 40. And of course, the goal at the end of the game is one side is holding 100 chips and one side's holding 0. And that creates all of these unique risk management decisions along the way where you're trading win probability. Hey, if I go for it on 4th down and I succeed, I get this kind of a boost. If I fail, I lose this amount. If I take the conservative action and punt, there's a benchmark. So I stand to gain this much, I stand to risk this much. What's the probability of my success? And it's far more complicated than that because there's all kinds of distributions of outcomes. It's not just binary. Sometimes you get tackled behind the line of scrimmage. Sometimes you get a long gainer. Sometimes you just make the 1st down. But you're effectively trading win probability chips, right? And that's all well and good, but you got to be able to measure them. And how do you measure it? Well, you need a really good simulation model, and that's what we had. So it's kind of a two-part thing. I mean, one, you needed the technology to a really good way to measure not just generic teams, but custom teams. In a matchup, in a given game state, what's their win probability in different situations? And then secondly, you need to know how to use it in a game strategy context. So, yeah, great. You can measure what win probability is in all these different situations and how much it gets impacted by different decisions and execution. But how do you use that as a strategy to make better risk management decisions? And so that was a big layer of what we were doing as well. We weren't just handing people the model. We were saying, here it is, and here's how you use it effectively. So there was a lot of hand holding as well.
Sure. Now you must have had a meeting with Bill Belichick.
We did. So, little known is that Bill Belichick has a right-hand guy by the name of Ernie Adams. They went to college together. Ernie's a very bright guy. He likes to stay out of the spotlight. I haven't spoken to him in years, so I don't even know if or what he's up to these days, if anything. But Ernie was the guy that was always kind of sniffing around what was going on in the analytics world. And I can't remember how we first came into contact with Ernie. We met him at the NFL Combine. I had multiple phone calls with him, and he was just a really curious guy about anybody that was doing anything kind of on the cutting edge. And he would do things like, ask us to look at all of their decisions from the Super Bowl, or, look at our 2-point conversion chart, that cheat sheet that the coaches use on the side. They had one that was, I think, developed by a professor at Rutgers that they used to use. And one time they went to us, and Ernie did, and said, hey, what do you think of this? And I remember my response was, yeah, we largely agree with it. And the stuff we disagree with it is like morsels of value. The thing about 2-point conversions is it's the obvious ones that are worth a lot. And the really complex ones that are harder to figure out are worth fractions of a percent typically or something. But, at the same time, I would say to him, the real value is in the fourth down decisions. Like that, that's where you got like 10, sometimes 10, 15% of win probability at stake, and people don't even know it. No one even talks about it. So he was very curious, and we get a call from him saying, "Hey, Bill would like to meet with you guys. Are you ever going to be up in New England? And we like to meet with you and come to Foxborough." And so at the time, we were, sort of bright-eyed. I don't remember what year this was exactly, to be honest, but I had met Ernie before, but this was like, hey, this is Bill Belichick. This guy's got a bunch of Super Bowl rings. We better get on a plane and go meet with him. So Chuck and I went up to Foxborough and met with them. We went into their film room and met with Ernie, and we were talking to him for a while. And he's like, well, Bill's going to come join us here in a little bit. And, he comes walking in through the back door, and just like you'd sort of expect him, with the hoodie and kind of shuffling along. He doesn't like to smile much. And, he just had this attitude like he was going to be in the room for 10 minutes and then tell us to go to hell or whatever. Turned out he was very curious. He's like, these guys came up here. I'm going to get as much information as I can. We ended up spending 4 hours with him. I remember it well. And they went over Super Bowl decisions and all kinds of different decisions. And, I respected him as a coach. It's hard to argue with that many wins. I mean, he obviously had some great players, but I was never, I think at the time we thought he was better than an average risk management decision maker in the game, but that wasn't a very high bar at the time. And he had done a very controversial decision in the playoffs against the Colts where he went for it on a 4th and 2 in his own territory and failed. And then Peyton Manning scored a touchdown, and he was barbecued over that. In fact, I ended up writing a big feature article for the New York Times on that decision. It was called The Anatomy of a Fourth Down Decision at the time. And I defended Belichick, actually. So, we met with him, and, we were hopeful that, maybe something would come of this. And it became apparent that they were, it was a big sort of fact-finding, sniffing session. And they were going to try to get as much information as they could. And there were two particular moments in the meeting that really struck me. One that I kind of said, hey, that's pretty impressive. And the other that I said, wow, that's pretty disappointing. The impressive one is that at the time, this was before they moved the kickoff line. So before they had all the concussion protocols in the NFL, there used to be a lot of runbacks on kickoffs, and those are high-speed collisions, right? That became pretty controversial, and they changed the rules, and now it's like every kickoff's a touchback almost, although that's starting to change a little bit. But at the time, an average NFL kicker was probably only getting a touchback rate. I want to say it was like between 15 and 20% or something like that. And we had done an interesting study, which was to say, what if you had a kicker on your team? Somebody with just a massive leg that wasn't very accurate for field goals, but they could kick it in an unusually high touchback rate. So we did a study with the model to as an experiment to say, what if you had somebody that could take you from a 20% touchback rate to a 100% touchback rate? Imagine this person exists, or you could go find them or train them or what have you. What would that be worth to an NFL team in season expected wins? And we ran the analysis on this. It was like, wow, it was really something. And I think at the time we had concluded, I might be getting this just a little bit off, but I think at the time we concluded it was worth about a game and a quarter a season.
Wow. That's huge.
If this person could exist. And we posed the question to Belichick. And I remember he kind of just, sort of looked off into the corner and was thinking about it. And he goes, I think he said so. At the time, he gave an answer that was within a quarter of our answer. I think he said either one game or a game and a half or something like that. And I was pretty impressed by that. And that wasn't a number he pulled out of the air. He had clearly thought about this problem and actually probably put some pen to paper on it, or had one of his staff or Ernie did it. So that was pretty impressive, right? Because those were the kinds of studies, those were the kinds of hypotheticals we could do. We also did one time where we were like, what if you had a kicker that could kick a 50-50 jump ball as an onside kick on every kickoff? So you had a 50% chance of recovering.
Wow. Yeah.
That was worth over a game a season, right?
So
those are all kind of really interesting little problems. But as much as Belichick's response to that was impressive, a little while later, we were demoing the model and I was giving just a very basic, I was kind of setting up the framework of how the model works. And I was giving a very basic example that no head coach would get wrong, which is it's the last play of the game. You're on the opposing 2-yard line. You're trailing by 2 points. Everybody knows you kick a field goal. You could go for the touchdown. You might get it half the time. When you succeed, it doesn't mean you did something smart. And when, and if you miss the field goal 1% of the time or 2% of the time, it doesn't mean you did something stupid. I was trying to give the example, you don't play results, and how our model, no coach gets that wrong, but our model handles much more complex situations in the same way. So I was using this as an illustration. And he stops me and he says, wait a minute, how do you know that you get in 50% of the time if you tried to get a touchdown from the 2-yard line? Like a 2-point conversion rate, basically. And I said, well, coach, that's just, there's empirical data that supports that league average. And I said, I'm just using it as an example. We can use whatever number you want. I said, I'm just using it as for illustrative purposes. And he's like, yeah, he goes, sometimes I'm 100% and sometimes I'm 0%. I said, what? I'm thinking, this is the guy that's supposed to be the genius of the NFL. Did he really just say this? I remember leaving the meeting and thinking I really missed an opportunity for a zinger. I should have said to him, hey, coach, the next time you're 100%, you're going to make it from the 2-yard line. You can lay me, some pretty good odds on that. And I'll be happy to, or you can give me some pretty good odds on it. I'd be happy to take it. Yeah. So, anyway, that was an interesting meeting. He was kind of what you expected. Nothing really ever came of it commercially with those guys. We talked to them a bunch, but they were not one of our 12 teams that ever paid us to do anything. Our best clients were the Eagles and the Chiefs, basically. We worked with Miami. We worked with Carolina. We worked with Dallas. We worked with Pittsburgh, Jacksonville, Detroit, Carolina, the Rams. There were quite a few.
Okay, well, I'm going to take a brief break for a commercial, and then we're going to come right back and talk about who I suspect were actually your best clients, which is when the gamblers came to call. We'll be right back. Okay, we're back. And so yeah, you have some teams, they're using it, but then people who want to make real money with it. By the way, before we even get to that, I just have to say, it seems crazy to me that they wouldn't just buy this because it's not their money, right? The owner is paying for it. So why wouldn't you have it? Even if you're not going to listen to it, you could at least, look at it. At the, what it says.
There's a few things there. I mean, one is they're cheapskates. 2 is they're very protective. They want to do everything in-house. And I'm sure at some point in time, if I would have said, hey, I'll be your in-house analyst, they would have offered me some very modest salary to go work in-house for them, which I would have had zero interest in doing. Also, there's a little bit of a fear of what you don't understand. I mean, in thinking in expected value and understanding variance, that's a very foreign concept to a lot of people. And, as Terry Donahue, the GM of the 49ers, once said to me, your biggest challenge in dealing with NFL teams is you're dealing with a bunch of PE majors. They don't necessarily understand.
That's a great line.
They don't understand math. And I think he's right. So there were a lot of things going on there. I think also these head coaches, there's egos. There's a little concern they're going to get exposed, and they're going to relinquish some level of control. And we always tried to combat that with saying, look, we're not here to be some robotic replacement of what you do. There's what you do is an art form. You know your players, you know their motivations, you know how to design. We're not telling you what plays to design in which situations. We're just telling you that directionally when to take more or less aggressive actions pays big dividends. And then once you've got the information, do what you please with it, but you at least ought to know. You ought to at least be aware of it. So that was always kind of our pitch. And I think it worked to some degree. I mean, teams, would subscribe, but it wasn't a big moneymaker. So,
but then the gamblers found out about it.
The gamblers found out about us. They did. And funny enough, I think some of them, when they read or caught wind of what we were doing, had more confidence in our abilities than we probably had. I mean, I think we always believed we could shine a light on the relative merits of a play calling decision and the difference in cost. But we were never really that confident that our absolute numbers were better than market prices. I mean, let's face it, these sports markets, the NFL, those are big markets. There's a lot of money by a lot of sophisticated people being bet. Those prices reach some kind of a fair market equilibrium, and that's a really good representation of a wisdom of a crowd. And we just never thought, especially with juice, that we could ever really sort of overcome those numbers. We did think if there ever was going to be an in-running market, live win probabilities trading, that we might be onto something, because we were very good at all the nuances of the in-game game state as the clock was changing, the ball position was changing. But there really wasn't at the time a robust market for that. There was a little bit in Europe, and some groups dabbled in it and used our information for it, but there wasn't a lot of liquidity. But along the way, there were some betting syndicates that said, hey, would you guys be willing to just run reports for us? And our model, quite frankly, had been getting a lot better. We were getting very good at customizing teams on their attributes and how they had performed year to date. So typically by about week 5 in the season, we could configure who we thought that team was based on their prior performances. We could then take the next game, make home field adjustments, and simulate from the opening kickoff based on who we thought those two teams were. We could come up with a distribution of outcomes that predicted not only what we thought the fair value of the total and the point spread was and the money line, but also what the distribution of that looked like, the histogram of it. And this was very appealing to bettors. And with some encouragement, we were asked to produce reports. And there was a time when there were a few different people that would buy our reports, and there wasn't a lot of exclusivity to it. But then when we got pretty serious about it, there were groups that just wanted to basically said, we'll buy it, but don't sell it to anybody else. And this was before the repeal of PASPA, the Professional Amateur Sports Protection Act, which, basically opened up the regulated market in the US. So we were also treading very carefully because we were analysts. We weren't sports bettors. We weren't risking our own money. Quite frankly, we knew that was illegal in the US and we weren't going to do that. And our attitude was, we're producing reports. We're simulating games. People can use that for whatever purpose they want. It could be sports media. It could be fantasy. It could be a team. It could be a sports bettor. It's their business what they want to do with the information. If they want to buy it from us, terrific. Turned out that of the groups I just mentioned, some of the betting syndicates saw the best value proposition in that and were the most interested in having us do it and lock us up. So we did have some very meaningful relationships along the way where we would produce these reports. We would look at all the games on the slate, typically beginning in week 5 after we had a little bit of a running average of some data for a while. And we would simulate the games. We would simulate it under different assumptions. I won't go into all the detail on that, but one assumption might be going into this week, they're basically how they're configured as a representation of how they've played in the last 4 games. Later in the season, we might put a heavier weight on recent performance, or we might make certain adjustments if a game was won or lost on turnovers, on key turnovers or something like that. Then also sometimes the clients would say, we're not sure who the starting quarterback's going to be. Run them as a 70th percentile passing offense and run them as a 50th percentile passing offense. Run two different scenarios. So we would run all these different simulated scenarios and then compare it to the market price and basically say, we think these are the most mispriced games of the week based on these assumptions and these simulations. Sometimes we might run 6 or 7 different assumptions, and under all of those assumption conditions, they all were off market. And that would be a major flag. And then we'd look at that game and say, okay, are we missing anything? Is there anything we don't know about? No. This looks mispriced, and those were usually the ones that got the most attention. We didn't want to know what they were doing with the data, how much they were betting or anything like that. It was basically, we were basically selling a subscription, but it was a pretty handsome subscription. And, that's,
were you not tempted to be betting it yourself?
Well, of course, but there were a few issues there. One is there weren't any legal channels for us to do it unless we kind of flew out and went to the bricks and mortars in Las Vegas. We recognized, against traditional juice, based on what we thought our edge might be, the amount of size we would have to get down and risk we would take to generate that return. And, we did the math on it. If there was somebody out there who was much better at executing than us on both size and price, and they were willing to pay us upfront guaranteed, I mean, I did the math on it. It was almost a no-brainer just to sell a subscription, quite frankly. And honestly, even if the market was as it is today, I'm still not sure I would have done it much differently, because just, I know firsthand, I mean, even in today's market, the challenge it is to execute for size, particularly in the regulated market. But yes, there was a temptation and, to dabble there a little bit, but I think it was a much better structure, the one we had.
Yeah. But now since PASPA, you can bet and have access to other markets. So are you out there making a bet or two? No, and I'm really not. Not with the process that we used to have. So one of, I guess, the sort of advantages of our methodology and our technology was that we would see in advance things that we thought were mispriced. And early on, when we were doing this, we would see somewhere, I think like maybe it was like 80 plus games out of maybe 260-ish that we thought had value in them. And we saw it dwindle every year. We also thought there was mispricing between the money lines and the point spreads. There was conventional wisdom on those relationships. Our simulations were showing differently that conventional wisdom wasn't. And then we saw that curve tighten up over a couple of years. We could see it. We saw the number of plays that we thought were mispriced start to dry up. So markets get smarter. I mean, I know this from the energy markets, right? You can find things that are, that there's value and mispricing, but we saw that we saw the opportunities start to dry up over time. Well, listen, I am running out of time, but I want to thank you. This has been really interesting. I know my audience will find this all fascinating. So,
thanks, Richard. I hope we covered some good ground there. And it's been a lot of fun. And I continue to work in the analytics space and in the sports betting space. So I've always kind of got my ear to the ground and what's the latest going on in those areas. And it's been a fun journey.
All right. Well, that's it for this episode, everybody. As always, you can reach me at lifeisagamblepod@gmail.com, or you can find me on Twitter at RWM21. Until next time.